Do you ever do the thing where you're just cruising along in life, normal day, doing normal stuff, business, sports, working out, hanging out with people, whatever, and you think back at random to some stupid, socially off thing that you did years and years and years ago, and then you feel almost this physical revulsion at the social decision that you made, this shudder of knowingness that an earlier you didn't get it, and that in whatever situation you're envisioning, you thought that would be a good idea. I hesitate to share any specifics about what kind of stuff I'm picturing, but I'm just imagining dumb things I said in front of large groups of people. I'm imagining incredibly socially awkward things that I said and did in middle school and high school, and unfortunately on into adulthood. I'm thinking of dumb, clumsy jokes that didn't land, just not getting the tone of the moment. I would like to think that I'm always trying to get better at this and that I'm improving at being a tone recognizer, but it makes me cringe when I picture the moments where I didn't recognize it and I let everybody know with my words or my actions. And I have to think that old man Peter, looking back on his life, had several of those as well. Maybe that's why I feel so empathetic toward him and patient toward him as we read through the Bible and he does dumb stuff, because I got a bajillion of those. And he has one right here in Matthew chapter 17 with the transfiguration. I don't blame him. He doesn't know what to do. It's a moment that no one else has ever experienced, ever. And so what's the protocol for when you're hanging out with a friend and suddenly he's enveloped in the glory of God and shines like the sun, and you suddenly have confirmed beyond the shadow of any doubt that's actually God in the flesh and the Messiah? I mean, nobody knows what to do in that situation. And I guess when you don't know what to do socially, probably often the best thing to do is just shut up, close your yap, and take a little more time to size up the situation. But Peter being like me and being like Peter, I'm sympathetic to the guy who can't keep his mouth shut and feels like he needs to do something. So here we are, Matthew 17, verse 1. It's the transfiguration. We've been talking about this for a couple days. It goes like this. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, that's the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. Matthew's just so casual about it. He's like, yeah, they were up there, and then he was transfigured. You know how things can be. Picking it back up, he said, his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Again, Matthew. Then Moses and Elijah, they were there after that. And they were just, talking with Jesus. And so the next thing, you don't give us any warm-up or anything. He's just transformed. Moses and Elijah are there. And then we get into Peter's social gaffe. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. And if you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my son, whom I love, and with him I'm well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard that, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said, don't be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Obviously, there's a bunch more there than we've talked about so far, and we'll get to that, but I want to go back to the Peter thing. You got this transcendent moment, mind-boggling moment. There's no script for what you do in this moment, and Peter doesn't know how to cope with it, and he wants to do something good. He's like, somebody needs to take the lead. Somebody needs to do something. And so he runs the calculation in his brain. He's like, we should build little huts. Now, to you and me, that sounds absolutely stupid, because if such an event occurred in our lives, there's nothing culturally about us that would say we should build tiny little huts, like with thatched roofs or something, because an amazing thing happened. Like, whoa, did you see that walk-off grand slam? We should build a hut. Oh my goodness, did you see that bottle flip? It just flipped and landed straight up. We should build a hut. Oh my goodness, she said yes, you're getting engaged. It's amazing. We should build a hut. It's just not how we express celebratory bliss in our culture. But Peter's not completely out in left field here. There's some precedent that he's drawn on. Look, I don't know exactly what the guy was thinking. Clearly, the better move here would have been to just be quiet and see what happens next, but he goes for it. Okay. And maybe what he's drawing on here is some recollection of the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. It's like the happiest of all of the festivals of the Jewish festival year. It's drawn on the imagery of the little tents, the little huts that families built while they were out in the wilderness, while God was looking out for them and providing for them after they got away from Egypt. It's somewhere in Leviticus, one of the parts that isn't about discharges, where there's a bunch of details about exactly how you do it and how you celebrate that. And I think people celebrate it to this day. And so maybe Peter sees Moses standing there and he's like, I need to think of something to impress Moses. What is something I know that Moses was into? Spontaneously built thatched roof huts. Hey, Moses, I've read the books you wrote. How would you like it if I made a thatched roof hut like right about now? I know you're kind of a big fan of that stuff. So maybe that's what Peter was going for. Or maybe Peter is doing a really sophisticated theology move, drawing on the theology of the Old Testament book of Zechariah. I did not remember any of this off the top of my head. I had to go and Google something like part of the Old Testament where somebody talks about everybody celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles and the Messiah. And it turns out that that's Zechariah 14. So thank you, Google. And Zechariah 14 ends with this idea that Egypt and other nations are going to show up and celebrate the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles. And so I'll read you part of this just so that you know I'm not making things up. Zechariah 14:16. Then the survivors from all the nations that had attacked Jerusalem will go up year after year and worship the King, the Lord Almighty, and to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And so maybe what we're getting here is a completion of that old Abrahamic covenant notion that God is going to make a great nation out of the descendants of Abraham, and that nation is going to be a blessing to all the rest of the nations. And it seems to make sense. And so maybe Peter was thinking about that passage and he was like, well, the Messiah is here. We need to start this completion of prophecy where everybody comes and builds tabernacles from all around the world. What better time to start than now? What better place to start than here? What better group of people to start with than Moses and Elijah and Jesus? Like, let's get cracking. Let's make some booths. That isn't crazy. I don't know if that's a common theory or not, but it seems like it's possible that's what he was going for. It's also possible that he was just thinking, like, we're on top of this gigantic bald mountain, and the weather up here gets mean really quickly, and we've got some pretty important guests, like Moses and Elijah. Do you guys want somewhere to go where you've got like a roof over your head? Because I'll whip something up. I'll figure something out. You guys are the guests of honor here. You should be sitting somewhere better than just out in the middle of this windy weather on top of this mountain. And maybe he just wanted to make them more comfortable. Or maybe Peter is thinking in terms of the role of the tabernacle in the Old Testament. This is the place where God lives. And so I said he was God, and Jesus said, yep, I am the Messiah. You're right. That's from God. And then the transfiguration happens, and Peter's like, definitely, you're God. You need a hut. These guys are here. Maybe they're not God, but they could probably use huts as well. Whatever his motivation is, it is tonally incorrect for the moment. Nobody steps in and tells him, like, dude, you're being an idiot. We're not going to do that right now. It's just not hut time. Nobody steps in and is like, we don't really have hut material up here. Nobody steps in and is like, dude, can you just stop for 1 second and appreciate what is going on? Jesus doesn't correct him or rebuke him. He's just allowed to twist in the wind. And it's really interesting because as Peter is running his mouth and going on, he gets interrupted literally by God, who shows up in a bright cloud that envelops them and starts talking. It's not like, oh, some lightning struck and, oh, maybe that was God. I think it's a sign, man. Maybe you better shut up. Like literally God shows up and says, this is my son whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him, which is obviously a throwback to the blessing at the end of chapter 3 in Jesus' baptism when God shows up. It says, and a voice from heaven said, Matthew 3:17, this is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Peter didn't know what to do. The point of the passage is not Peter's an idiot. The point of the passage is the transcendence of God. And maybe a secondary point is that it can be a little disorienting and hard to know exactly what to do with that, whether you're standing there watching the transfiguration happen, or whether it's 2,000 years after the fact and you're listening to a podcast in your unitard on the treadmill at the club and you're like 4 miles into your run and you've sweated that little kitten pattern onto your chest and you're sitting here thinking about the transcendent things of God as you listen to this and you're trying to figure out what you do with these claims exactly. It's hard. It's difficult. It's going to be a little bit fumbling to figure out what to do with a truth, a reality like this. And Peter simultaneously wants to stay in the moment forever. Like, let's build some houses. Let's set up shop up here. Let's just do this. And Peter, though he doesn't know how to stay in the moment exactly, he wants to make some kind of move with his hands here to stay in the moment longer. We don't ever need to come off this mountain. We got Moses and Elijah and Jesus here. Remember yesterday I was telling you about the time travel tokens and how I'd use them? I bet if you'd asked Peter, he would have said he would have used his time travel token to go and hang out with Moses and Elijah. And now they're here. I have so many questions. There are a billion things we need to talk about. Maybe the jokes about what happens when you go to heaven in Peter's day didn't involve Peter standing at the gate, but Moses and Elijah at the pearly gates. There were punchlines here. There was knowledge to be gleaned. There was truth to be uncovered. And so understandably, the guy's like, well, let's build a little shelter and let's hang out there for a while and let's chat it up. He wanted to stay in the moment. He wanted to stay on the mountain, even if he didn't know exactly how to execute it. But everything about the words of God who shows up, about the fact that everybody just clears out, stuff that we'll talk more about tomorrow, everything about the way the narrative unfolds and about the way Jesus and God the Father guide this narrative in this situation makes it clear that the impulse of God was to get back down the mountain and get back into the fray. And indeed, the very next passage is going to be Jesus and the disciples come down the mountain. Somebody's right there and they're like, somebody's sick. Please heal more stuff. Right back into the fray. So Peter wants to linger. It's understandable that he wants to linger. He doesn't know how to linger in this moment. It's understandable that he doesn't know how to linger in this moment. James and John probably did the smart thing. Keep your mouths shut and just take it in. Peter is always who Peter is, so he plays it the way he plays it. He comes off looking a little bit silly, but again, looking silly in this situation is like striking out or committing an error in the World Series. Remember, you got to the World Series. It's pretty cool. Thank you a ton to all of you who have jumped in to sponsor a kid through Africa Renewal. We are cutting into the backlog of unsponsored kids in Uganda, and that's because of you. So thank you a ton. There's still a bunch of kids who need sponsorship. If you're still thinking about sponsoring a kid in Uganda for $40 a month, you can learn more about that at africarenewal.org/TMBH. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.